John's Gospel has now brought us to the final evening before the crucifixion. This is the time of the Last Supper on Thursday night. And we pick the story up in John chapter 13. It was just before the Passover feast, and Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God, and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you'll never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Well then, Lord," Simon Peter said, "not just my feet, but my head and my hands as well." And Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not every one of them was clean. When he'd finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, and nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them." So we've arrived at Thursday evening, and the Last Supper has been prepared, or is being prepared, and it's the great feast. It's a little bit earlier than would normally be the case, I think, because the great Passover meal may well have been normally done on the Sabbath itself, on when the feast would have been partaken of. But Jesus knew that he would be dying the very next day. And so with great deliberation in mind, he sets up this Last Supper on Thursday night, just before the betrayal and the crucifixion. And it says that it was just before the Passover feast, so it was the day before. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave the world and to go to the Father. He'd been predicting his death for, well, the last 3 years, really, knowing full well that this was now the point at which it had now reached, and that which was full of dread and pain and sorrow was now upon him. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. And that full extent is explained by Jesus when he said that no greater love can be shown than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And that's like, it's the extreme position of love. Self-sacrifice is the very core, hallmark of love itself. And this kind of self-sacrifice is to the greatest extent that it could be if you give up everything, but giving up in particular your life for the benefit of other people. So this is now to be seen as the motif which will now run through the next few days, and which the disciples will be taken up with in the most shocking and brutal way. The evening meal was being served. So there we have the Last Supper. And the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. We know that shortly after the triumphal entry, Judas had already gone to the high priests and offered his services in exchange for some money, those 30 pieces of silver. And he had struck a bargain with them that he would look out for an opportune moment when he would bring them to Jesus at the time in order to arrest him. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. And at this point we pick up the motif of John's Gospel. You remember that the very first verse in John's Gospel is the one which explains all other verses. If we accept the first verse, then we can accept everything else that follows. And if we reject the first verse, then nothing else makes sense. The first verse being, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That second statement, the Word was with God, is being referenced here, that he had come from God. But the corollary of that is, and was now returning to God. So it says, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, we might ask the question, what was it that prompted this unusual behaviour? Certainly it took the disciples by surprise. They had never come across this kind of action before, except as done by the most menial of servants. When a person in Israel or in a dusty desert country had been travelling, they wore sandals in those days. They didn't wear enclosed shoes, and so as you walked through the dusty road, because they didn't have any tarmac road, it was dust and dirt and sand everywhere. As they walked from one place to another, as they did all the time, their feet always got dirty, filthy, and that was the thing which occurred whenever you went from one place to another. Even the main streets of the town would be full of dust and dirt, so the feet were constantly getting dirty and needed washing. And the washing was done by the most menial of the servants. There would be servants who would do cooking, servants who would do cleaning, but the lowest servant of all would be the one who would wash someone's feet. It was the act of a menial, of a lower level person in the hierarchy, maybe even of a slave, if you had a slave. So, but what actually prompted Jesus to perform this particular act at this particular time? Well, we can't be certain, but there is a clue. It's a clue which we find in Luke's Gospel at the same time in the Last Supper. There's an event here which takes place in the middle of the Last Supper, from Luke chapter 22 and verse 24. Let me read to you about what happened during the Last Supper. This is after they've eaten the meal. This is after they've taken the cup and the bread and distributed it around. And after that, it said, they began to question among themselves. A dispute arose amongst them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. This was prompted somewhat, I think, by the fact that Jesus said that some of you are clean and one is not. Implication being that some are better than others. As a dispute arose amongst them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest, therefore. And Jesus said to them, the kings and of course James and John had their mother at one time come and ask the question as to whether they could sit at the right or the left hand of Jesus. There's this pecking order amongst the disciples seemed to be very important to some of them. And in becoming important like that, it became quite clear that they'd misunderstood the whole nature of the relationship between themselves and between them and Jesus. And Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest amongst you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But amongst you, as one who serves. And you are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom such as my Father conferred on me, so that you may drink and eat at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. It then goes on to talk about Jesus and predicting not only his betrayal but also Peter's denial. So it's in the same kind of time scale and the same context. So here we have this dispute. It started off amongst disciples claiming that I'm greater than you. No, I'm going to be closer to Jesus in the kingdom. No, I'm going to be a bit closer than you are. Well, maybe John and James, they might be high up, and then we're going to be second to them. Those kind of debates. And the whole thing was totally misconceived from the point of view of what they should be learning. So how does Jesus teach them the true place and true role that they must have in the way in which they deal with each other? Well, here we have it. We have it so that he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he began pouring water in a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, this whole action is the action, as we've said, of a menial servant. It's of someone who is of no consequence in the household. It's not the action of what a master does. It's the action of what the lowest person does. And so when he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? In other words, you're my Lord. You shouldn't act like a servant to me. You shouldn't act like a slave to me. I won't allow it. And Jesus replies, you don't realize what I'm doing, but later you will understand. Of course, later they did understand, because Jesus is inverting the whole notion of the greatest person is the one who lords it over somebody else. That's how it is in the world, says Jesus. But with you, the greatest person is the one who serves the most. And Jesus, of course, exemplifies that, because he is the greatest, because he is the humble servant who gives up everything for all the others, including his life. So Jesus says, you don't realize now what I'm doing, but you will later. And Peter says, no, you'll never wash my feet, meaning you'll never be viewed by me as a servant. You'll never be viewed as someone who is menial and below consideration. You'll never be viewed by me as a mere slave who does the most menial of tasks. I worship you and adore you, and I hold you in high esteem. So you cannot play that role with me, Jesus. I don't see you in that light. But Jesus says, unless I wash you, you have no part in me. That's enough for Simon Peter. He wants every part with Jesus. He wants to be so connected with him. So he says, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Now, that could mean that wash, not the role of the menial servant who only washes the feet, but rather I think what it means here is the idea that if washing me means I want a part of you and you're a part of me, then wash all of me, because I so much want to be connected to you, Jesus. Not just my feet, every part of me is devoted to you. Jesus says a person who has had a bath and he needs to wash his feet and his whole body is clean. And you're clean, though you not every one of you, referring of course to Judas, because he knew who was going to betray him. And that was why he did not say everyone was clean. This is a different kind of cleanliness. It's a moral cleanliness, of course, here. And the idea of washing is always related to physical cleanliness, but typifies and signifies moral cleanliness as well, which is what baptism is about. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place and said, "Do you understand what I have done for you?" He asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord." In other words, I'm not a menial servant. I am your Lord. I am the one who you look to as your ruler, guider, even as your king, king of the kingdom. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. But now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, in other words, I have taken on the role of the lowest person in the household, then you should also wash one another's feet. See how the inversion now is so powerfully expressed by this act, teaching through a graphical demonstration of this act. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Now that's an interesting. He says, as I have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Does this mean that there should be a feet washing ceremony within churches, for example? And there are some churches which do that same kind of thing. Is that what Jesus is indicating here? I think we have to be very careful with that kind of an idea, simply because it's very easy for us to take the ritual, the act of washing feet, and to miss the whole point of what it actually means. It's not really about, when he says, you should also wash one another's feet, we can miss the import or the meaning of that if we concentrate on the act of feet washing. It's really what it symbolizes which is the most important and central thing here. The idea that you should be a servant one to another, that you should serve each other and put each other first. And if we were to concentrate on rituals, and rituals are always a problem, because rituals tend to act as a substitute for the genuine thing. The ritual is something which you can perform, an act which you can do, and yet completely forget that it actually is meant to symbolize something of much greater import, something of greater reality behind it. And we end up often just performing the ritual and not performing the reality. So if we were to concentrate purely on the question of whether we should wash each other's feet, I would suggest that actually what Jesus is getting at here is that rather we should be servants of one another, that we should treat each other not as people who can lord it over others, who seek to coerce other people to do what we want them to do, to control them, to impress upon them our will rather than allow them the chance to choose for themselves. On the contrary, it seems to me that the idea of the servant is the one who places themselves at the disposal of someone else, who will do the menial tasks and the base tasks for somebody out of sheer love and concern for them. It's taking on the role of a servant and not taking on the role of the master. And if the master himself will take on the role of the servant as an example, then it behoves all of us to take on that same servant role. And in fact, you can see Paul has described this whole event and this whole attitude for us in his letter to the Philippians, if I can just turn that up for you. He describes Jesus as someone who took on this servant role, and how that's a model for us to take this on. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, he says in 2 Philippians verse 5, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but rather made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And therefore God exalted him to the highest place, and gave him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Here is the paradox of Christian order, because in this paradoxical way, it is the person who takes the lowest position who is the one who is in the highest position. It's the person who is the servant who becomes the master. And it's the person who is the servant of all who becomes the master of all. Don't spend your time trying to aggrandize yourself or your position. Don't bother trying to work out who is greatest in the kingdom of God, or who is deserving of greater honour, because I have laid down the pattern for you. And the pattern is not really about feet washing. That was just the picture. That was just the earthly example. But the reality here is quite simple and straightforward, that if you serve all and become the servant of all, then your position in the kingdom of heaven will be high and will be great. Blessed will you be if you do these things, says Jesus. There's a blessing attached to that kind of action and behaviour. If you act in this way and put yourself at the disposal of all others for the sake of love, then you will be blessed indeed, says Jesus.